Right, now we're going to look a little bit into taxes as they relate to the labor market. And a classic graph that relates to tax rates and the amount of tax revenue the government, I should say, receives is the Laffer curve. So what does the Laffer curve look like? Well, it graphs on the horizontal axis the size of the tax. So you can think of it as tax rates starting at 0, and then as we move to the right on the horizontal axis, we're getting bigger and bigger and bigger rates of tax. So 50 and 60 and 70 and 80%, all the way up to 100% tax. And if you taxed fully 100%, you'd probably collect nothing because nobody would do any work. And on the vertical axis, you see tax revenue, so the amount of money that the government would collect in taxes. So there is some maximum for an economy that the government can collect in tax revenue, and this theory suggests that there is some tax star, right, equilibrium or optimal, I should say, tax rate that if the government chose just the right tax rate, it could maximize its tax revenue collections. Well, Laffer was an economic advisor to President Reagan, and the two of them had a discussion and sort of came up with an idea that in the 80s it was believed that taxes, the income tax on labor, was too high. They hypothesized that we were somewhere in the vicinity of point A on the graph. So at this very, very high tax rate, right, high tax size, that the government actually wasn't collecting as much revenue in taxes as they could because there was a disincentive to work. And so the Laffer curve suggests that if we move backwards, so where the yellow arrows are sort of leading us back to the left, if we would reduce the tax rate, we would actually collect more in tax revenues because people would have more of an incentive to work. So an example would be when my father, who was an hourly worker, he was not a salaried guy, he worked in a boiler room, and he was paid overtime rates and holiday pay in direct proportion to the number of hours that he worked per week and the days that he was scheduled. And there were times in the year where he would not work on a weekend, and I would say, you're home. You're not working today? You're not doing any overtime? And he would say, Uncle Sam's going to take all of my extra anyway. What's the point? And he would, stay home and watch hockey instead of working. That's the kind of capture that is behind the thinking of the Laffer curve, that if rates are too high, there's a disincentive to work. And so to sort of wrap this up, this falls under what many economists called supply-side economic theory, where President Reagan and Laffer believed that if you lower tax rates, people would work more, and that would increase tax revenue to the government. A major assumption behind all of this is that the labor supply is elastic, and not everyone agrees with that. And there are some questions as to whether or not the reduction in tax rates were successful during President Reagan's term. So take this with a grain of salt, but the Laffer curve and supply-side economics are talked about even today, so it's something that you should be aware of.